Capital punishment is an inhumane and ineffective way of punishing criminals and deterring crime, and it needs to be abolished. Capital punishment, also known as the death penalty, is when a crime is committed and the punishment decided for the perpetrator is death. Not only does the death penalty give the government the power to kill its own citizens, a few of whom might even be innocent, but it does not make a country, state, or region any safer. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, 88% of the top criminological experts agree that the death penalty does not deter criminals from committing crime or reduce the homicide rate in any way. In the past, many cultures and societies had some form of the death penalty to punish those who they considered criminals. However, after World War II, there began a trend that slowly spread across Europe and the rest of the world, abolishing the use of the death penalty. Now there are only 36 countries that actively use capital punishment. Nearly all of these countries, aside from the US and Japan, are countries that have very bad human rights records, such as Sudan or Somalia. And many of them have repressive regimes, such as North Korea, Iran, or Saudi Arabia. Of the top 10 countries that used the death penalty in 2013, aside from the US and Japan, none of them had democratic governments. Focusing on the United States, where capital punishment is legal in 31 out of 50 states, the majority of these states are in the South, where, strangely enough, homicide rates continue to remain higher than in the rest of the country. In 2014, 35 inmates were executed, and over 3,000 were on death row in the United States. Most of these were in Texas. Texas has performed more executions than any other state. Not only is killing inmates an inhumane and barbaric way of punishing crime, but it also does not make life any safer for its citizens. There's currently no evidence that can prove that capital punishment deters crime. FBI data shows that the 14 states that do not use capital punishment have homicide rates lower or at the national line. The death penalty is also used disproportionately against the poor, minorities, and those who are mentally ill. According to Amnesty International, since 1977, 77% of all death row inmates have been executed for killing white victims, even though half of the homicide victims are African Americans. Also, Amnesty International says that almost all of the death row inmates could not afford their own attorney to defend them in a trial, thus perpetuating the cycle of the death penalty being used more often to punish the poor. Richer, more powerful defendants are able to pay for their own defense team, making it less likely for them to get put on death row, regardless of their crime. However, many people that support the death penalty argue that the cost of maintaining prisoners for life is more expensive for the taxpayer than paying for an execution. However, this is not the case. Capital punishment is by far the most expensive way of punishing criminals. The greatest cost occurred during the trial and appeals processes and in the post-conviction proceedings, making the death penalty much more expensive than alternative sentences. These costs depend on the state. However, according to the California Commission for Justice, the current system in California cost $137 million per year and could be reduced to $11.5 million without the death penalty. In Maryland, the Urban Institute found that the death penalty cost 3 times more than regular cases, meaning that each death penalty case cost the taxpayers about $3 million. In Texas, a single death penalty case cost about $2.3 million, which is 3 times the cost of imprisoning a criminal in a single cell at the highest level of security for 40 years, according to the Dallas Morning News. So as you can see, the death penalty is not a cost-effective way of dealing with our overcrowded prisons. Also, innocent lives are sometimes taken, and people have been wrongly executed. Since 1973, 140 people on death row have been proven innocent and therefore released. Many claim that they are innocent, but do not have the resources or the evidence to prove it. There have only been 138 volunteer executions since 1978, meaning that the vast majority of those executed were forced. If murder is wrong, then why is it okay for the state to commit it? Why do Americans fret at giving the government the power to interfere in business, but hardly even blink at the idea of the government taking a human life? Do we think that executing these criminals solves the societal problems at the root of violence and crime? And wouldn't these millions of dollars spent each year on death row cases be better used by investing in programs for crime-ridden areas for children, for example, or on rehabilitation for prisoners? Capital punishment is an inhumane and ineffective way of handling criminals. Most Western countries have stopped practicing it, seeing it as barbaric. Of the few countries that still practice it, most are not democratic, and many have bad human rights records, such as China. It is expensive. It costs 2 to 3 times the cost of a regular sentence, and experts agree that it does not deter crime. Therefore, where the death penalty is used is not necessarily a safer area. The death penalty is also used disproportionately against minorities and the poor, those who cannot afford a proper defense team. The death penalty does not work. It's an inhumane way of handling criminals and perpetuates a vicious cycle of violence. And we cannot eradicate violence with violence. I'll close by quoting Mahatma Gandhi when he said the famous quote, "An eye for an eye, and the whole world goes blind."